Hello, my name is Keith, and these are my stamps. This is episode 21, Australia. Now, normally I do a separate part about geography, history, and then the stamps. However, I have so many stamps from Australia, it's the seventh highest number in my collection. I'm going to attempt to do it all together without making the video about 10 hours long. So let's see how it goes. Australia is to the south of Asia, with the Pacific Ocean to its east and the Indian Ocean to the west. It's made up of the huge mainland island of Australia, the island of Tasmania, and many smaller islands. Is it a continent? Well, some, including National Geographic, say yes, but even they aren't totally clear about it. Some call the continent Australasia, which, as you can see from this picture, includes New Zealand. Others say Oceania, which is what I tend to go for, which includes all of these different regions. Australia, it is 7,688,000 square kilometres, which is nearly 3 million square miles, which makes it the sixth largest country in the world, with a population of nearly 28 million, making it the 54th in the world. So a big difference, and it's just less than the population of Texas. 95% of that population live within 100 kilometres, 60 miles, of the coast. If you see the initials ACT on a map, or anywhere else for that matter, it could stand for the Australian Capital Territory, which is where the capital, surprise, surprise, Canberra is. Most of Australia is arid or semi-arid, but it has areas of tropical rainforests in the north. The name Australia comes from the Latin Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, which was used for a hypothetical continent for centuries before Europeans came across Australia. And so the word Australia comes from the Latin for southern. Australia is made up of 6 federated states: New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, and Western Australia, plus 10 federal territories, most of which are offshore. A couple of them are onshore, including the Northern Territories and the Australian Capital Territory. The federal territories include the Australian Antarctic Territory, which is Australia's claim to the area on the Antarctic, about 42% of the Antarctic. And like several other federal territories, that Australian Antarctic Territory issues their own stamps, for instance, Christmas Island and Norfolk Island. The stamps on this slide show a variety of state celebrations and anniversaries. These stamps were released with the name Australia. Each of the 6 states were, before Federation, individual colonies of Britain, and they issued their own stamps. The Northern Territories was governed by South Australia and was so not a separate colony. Australia, of course, has plenty of iconic animals, perhaps the most famous being the kangaroo and the koala. Although, having said that, the stamp to the top left here isn't a kangaroo, it's a wallaroo, and the stamp at the top right isn't a kangaroo either, it's a rock wallaby. However, they're all similar. I am going to try not to overuse the word iconic, but there are plenty of iconic things in Australia. Here are a couple of what I have always called maxi cards, but I've done some reading about it, and apparently not only does the stamp and the card have to match, but the postmark is supposed to also match in with the theme, which is not the case on these. However, I shall go wild, and I'm still going to call these maxi cards. The wombat one on the left is one that I actually sent in 2000. Australia is one of 17 designated mega diverse countries, which is a country where much of the flora and fauna are unique, and has issued plenty of stamps showing all of those. And here are just a few of the animals that have been on the stamps. The stamp in the centre at the bottom, the thylacine, is marked as endangered on this stamp. However, it's now officially extinct as more than 50 years have passed without a sighting. If you're feeling in the mood to get a bit sad, then check out endlings, which is the name given to the last known individual of a species. The last known individual thylacine was in Hobart Zoo in Tasmania and died in 1936. Here are some Australian birds. Perhaps the emu and the kookaburra are the most iconic, or most well known, perhaps I should say. For me, the rosella, which is the second row, second from the left, has a bit of history, as I visited Australia and I was sitting in a park eating an apple and was mobbed by a flock of them who all wanted a bit of my apple. Bit of a, although they're not very big, bit of a scary moment. Then some other creatures to be found in Australia, of course, many of which on these stamps are linked to the world's longest reef, the Great Barrier Reef, which lies off the northeast coast of Australia. It's 2,300 kilometres long, that's about 1,400 miles. And of course, with such a long coastline, Australia has an enormous variety of wildlife in the waters, and plus insects and various other things. Here are some of the flora, plants and fungus. It's estimated that only around 10% of Australia's fungi have actually been studied and named, and there is a great vast number still to be discovered. So the history of Australia. The dates on the slides are for the date of issue of the stamps. And I've tried to choose stamps that illustrate the historical event that I'm talking about. So, to begin with, 65,000 years ago was the first evidence of people in Australia. 20,000 years ago was the first evidence of the use of a boomerang. And you might be thinking, well, that's not a boomerang. Of course, you're right. I unbelievably could not find a picture of or an Australian stamp with a boomerang on it. And I couldn't even find a record of one that I don't have. So I found that kind of a bit surprising because the boomerang is iconic, dare I say. However, this plane was named Boomerang, so I've put that there. 12,000 years ago, the sea levels rose and separated Tasmania from the mainland. You can see Tasmania there as a separate island. In 1606, Willem Janssen of the Dutch East India Company mapped part of the coastline, followed by Abel Tasman, who's here on the stamps, and from where Tasmania gets its name. He, in 1642 and 1644, led excursions to make an almost complete map of Australia. You'll notice that the two stamps on the left are very similar, but they are the before and after currency change. So before is 4 shillings using the British system of pounds, shillings and pence, and at the bottom 40 cents for the Australian dollar and cents. The change happened in 1966, which is when that second stamp was issued. 1629, the Batavia, a ship of the Dutch East India Company, was wrecked off the coast of Western Australia whilst on its way to Batavia, which is present-day Jakarta. After the wreck, there ensued a mutiny, a massacre, executions, fights, all kinds of things, plus the marooning of two of the mutineers on the actual coast of Australia, becoming technically the first European residents, albeit unwillingly, of the country. And this is a prepaid envelope showing the 350th anniversary of that wreck. In 1699, William Dampier was the first Englishman to explore part of the Australian coast, including a scientific study of the plants and animals. And again, the stamp is before and after decimalisation. The stamp's on the left. From 1700s until 1970s, there was quite a lucrative trade going on between the people of Sulawesi, which is now in Indonesia, and Aboriginal people in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territories. In 1770, James Cook, on board the ship Endeavour, claimed eastern part of Australia for the British Crown and named it New South Wales. In 1788, the first fleet, led by Captain Arthur Phillip, arrived into Botany Bay and established a convict settlement. The first fleet was 11 British ships transporting settlers to Australia, not just convicts, but mostly. And it was the start of European colonisation of Australia. In 1791 was the establishment of the whaling industry, which went on until the last whaling station closed in 1978. In 1794 was the Hawkesbury River Massacre, which is the first acknowledged massacre of Aboriginal people by white settlers. And this is the first Aboriginal person to be featured on an Australian stamp, Gwoja Chungarai, also known as £1 Jimmy. 1797, the introduction of sheep to Australia. 1803, the British navigator Matthew Flinders led the first voyage circumnavigating Australia, and his use of the term Terra Australis helped Australia become the name of the country. In 1809, ex-convict Isaac Nichols was appointed the postmaster, and he set up the first post office in Australia in his home. Here he is on the stamp on the left, boarding the ship Experiment. Lachlan Macquarie was the governor of New South Wales. In 1815, he established Bathurst, which was the first inland town in Australia, but it came at great cost to the local Aboriginal people. He also officially recommended the name Australia to replace New Holland in 1817. These stamps are from the third series of Famous Australians and were only available in booklet form, which is why there are imperforated sides. In 1832, the start of assisted migration. Both the British and the Australian colonial governments subsidised or even paid fully for thousands of migrants to move to Australia. 1851, the gold rush began in New South Wales and Victoria. 1859, wild rabbits were introduced so they could be hunted for sport. Well, that didn't work out very well. The astute amongst you will notice that these are not stamps showing rabbits, because I couldn't find any. and I don't think there are any, which is not a great surprise because after the introduction, they soon got out of control. They devastated crops, and now it's estimated that there are over 150 million feral rabbits, despite all kinds of efforts to try and get rid of them. Even pet rabbits are banned in Queensland, for instance. The Pet series of stamps in 1996 did not show rabbits. There were cats, dogs, horses, no rabbits. 1868 was the end of convict transportation. January 1901, Australia became an independent nation. British Parliament passed legislation allowing the 6 Australian colonies to collectively govern as the Commonwealth of Australia. And the first definitive stamp inscribed Australia was the kangaroo and map, which there are 4 examples of there. The stamp was printed in 16 different years. There are different shades, different colors, different values, different perforations, different watermarks, all kinds of interesting things. If you are that way inclined, you can spend a long, long time sorting them out. On the bottom right, the stamps showing the centenary of the Federation shows the difference between the ordinary gum, the stamp on the left, and the self-adhesive gum, the stamp on the right. The perforations are a giveaway. The self-adhesive ones are kind of scalloped and even. The ones for the ordinary gum that you have to lick are kind of pointed and often a little bit torn because you have to tear them. In December of 1901, Australia decided on a White Australia policy, a policy designed to limit non-British migration, or at least non-white migration, and to remove any what were known as undesirable people who had already settled, which in lots of cases meant Chinese people. It was to do a lot with the gold rush that I spoke of earlier. This stamp isn't celebrating that policy. It's a joint issue with the United Kingdom, but it does show the kind of migrant that Australia wanted at the time. In 1906, Australia took control of Papua New Guinea as an external territory. And as you can see from this stamp, it lasted until 1975, when independence was granted. In 1911, the Australasian Antarctic Territory expeditions led by Douglas Mawson began, which led in the end to Australia claiming part of the Antarctic as their own territory. In 1913, the foundation of Canberra as the national capital. There was a big debate whether Sydney or Melbourne should be, and in the end they decided to build a new one halfway between the two. And the stamp on the left from 1927 is the first Australian commemorative stamp. 25th of April 1915, during the First World War, Australia and New Zealand soldiers landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and following year a commemorative parade was held and has been held ever since. The day is now known as Anzac Day, which stands for Australia and New Zealand Army Corps. 1928, Charles Kingsford Smith and crew landed in Brisbane after being the first to fly across the Pacific. 1932, the opening of the iconic Sydney Harbour Bridge. 1954, the visit of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, which was the first to Australia by a reigning monarch. The stamps on the right are from the decimal series that started in 1966. 1954 was the adoption of the current Australian flag. The issue on the right, the 3 of them from 1991, shows versions of the flag for the Australian Navy at the top, the Air Force in the middle, and the Merchant Marines at the bottom. 1956, the Summer Olympics were held in Melbourne. Well, everything except for the equestrian events, which were held in Sweden. But these were the first Olympics to be held in the Southern Hemisphere. 1966 was the end of the White Australia policy. You remember that's the one of deciding whether a migrant was welcome or not, depending on their skin colour. 1967, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders were granted recognition as part of the Australian population and were counted in censuses for the first time and acknowledged as equal citizens. 1973, the Sydney Opera House was completed. 1980, baby Azaria Chamberlain disappeared at Ayers Rock, the famous The Dingoes Got My Baby from Meryl Streep, leading to one of Australia's biggest legal and media events. Eventually, in 2012, a fourth official inquest finally agreed that the baby had in fact been taken by a dingo. Staying with Ayers Rock, in 1985, Ayers Rock was handed back to the Anangu people, becoming known as Uluru Ayers Rock. In the year 2000, Sydney hosted the Olympics, and you'll notice here that many of the stamps are still on the backing paper, because I find it really quite difficult to remove the self-adhesive ones. They kind of end up in a either ripped little blob or very, very thin. So after lots of disasters, I've decided to leave them on the backing paper most of the time. I know there are different kinds of liquids that you can get to try and ease this, but in the end, I've decided I don't mind them looking like this. So that's the history of Australia with a few of the stamps. Now, a few of the kind of others, shall we say. There are lots of perfins available on a whole variety of different stamps from Australia. These ones, going from the top left, OS is official service. SB stands for Sargood Brothers, who were a warehouse merchants from Melbourne. On the middle row, VG, the Victoria Government, and GNSW is the Government of New South Wales, which is also on the third row on the right. And at the bottom on the left, DJ Limited is David Jones Limited, who are general merchants in Sydney. There are also plenty of prepaid covers, imprints, whatever you want to call them, many of which in my youth I cut out because I thought they looked better, but now I know it's nicer to actually keep the whole thing. The cutouts on the left these particular ones come from a range of 1978, the birds in the top middle, to 1990, the one at the bottom left of Nullarbor. The aerogram is from 1983, and the variable value stamp, or sometimes called an ATM stamp, is from 1985. I also keep airmail and registered post labels. I know they're not stamps, but I kind of like them, and I keep them with my others collection. And finally, the last three to show you, or three groups to show you. The oldest I have are actually postage due stamps from 1904, the ones in the top left. Due to various disputes and arguments, the first definitives, the kangaroo map that we saw earlier, were not released until 12 years after Federation. However, postage due stamps were released after Federation. These are some of those. The bottom shows the first self-adhesive stamp, which was issued in 1990. It has the stamp from a booklet, which had ordinary gum that you had to lick on the left, and the self-adhesive one with the scalloped kind of perforations on the right. And finally, the stamp on the top right is my most recent stamp I have from Australia, which is from 2012, commemorating the London Olympics. So, these are my stamps. I'm Keith. Goodbye.